Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's session on green stimulus and the economic recovery package. This session is a part of Ananta's initiatives in the climate and energy nexus, which includes our recent series of digital sessions called Between a Rock and a Hard Place, a series that attempts to understand how we should navigate two existential crises at the same time, which are, of course, climate change and COVID-19. For the past decade, our most impactful climate engagement has been the India-US Track 2 dialogue on climate change and energy, which we convened in partnership with Aspen US. We are glad to have with us our chairman and the co-chair of the Track 2, Mr. JAMSHYD Godrej, along with two of our esteemed Indian delegates from the dialogue, Dr. NAVROZ DUBASH and Ms. SEEMA ARORA. Thank you all for joining us. Our moderator this morning will be Mr. BHATTACHARYA, who is the editorial director of Business Standard. Thank you, AKB. Over to you.
Thank you, Prerna. A very good morning to everyone here. And thank you for joining us today. As Prerna said, I'm Ashok Bhattacharya, and I'm going to be your moderator this morning. And we are here for a session on green stimulus and the economic relief package. The purpose or the objective behind holding this session, as you may have sensed already by now, is that the government in May had announced an economic relief package to stimulate the country's economy after it was ravaged by first COVID-19 pandemic and then, of course, the lockdown. This economic relief package, estimated at over rupees 21 lakh crore, have been analyzed from different perspectives using different lenses, economic, social, political. But what was felt was that this package was not adequately analyzed from the environmental and sustainability perspectives. So this session will try to highlight the environmental aspects of the current economic package and see in what way these packages could be further improved or leveraged for ensuring green growth and deliberate upon a climate-conscious economic rebuilding strategy going forward. Just one point I want to add here, that the subject matter of our session, green stimulus and the economic relief package, a lot of people might wonder that is green stimulus an oxymoron? In a sense that, can stimulus at all be green? So, I'm trying to raise this issue is probably because we need to really sort of, drive home the point that how can a stimulus be green? Or if there is a stimulus, and what is a stimulus after all? A stimulus could be in different forms. It could be through government spending. It could be through government tax cuts. It could be through a kind of interest rate cuts. So there are three broad kinds of stimuli, and can those stimuli be also green, and whether that can be seen as an oxymoron or not an oxymoron. This is something that I will put before our panelists also, and linking it with the economic relief package will be the purpose of this webinar, so that at the end of this session, we get a broad sense of what direction should any future economic relief packages should take to address the challenges of making a stimulus green. We are delighted to have three eminent speakers who will be taking part in this session, and they actually don't need any introduction, but I think we need to introduce them, and they are well-known people. We have Dr. NAVROZ DUBASH, who is a professor at the Center for Policy Research, and he is known for his research and writings on climate changes, energy, air pollution, water policy, and the politics of regulation in the developing world. Then we have Ms. SEEMA ARORA, who is at present the Deputy Director General of Confederation of Indian Industry, the apex body for Indian industry and trade. She's made a mark by pioneering the creation of services on sustainable development with CII, and has been working on designing innovative products and frameworks to build the business case for industry to invest in sustainability and corporate social responsibility. Last but not the least, we have Mr. JAMSHYD Godrej, who is the chairman of Ananta Center and also chairman of the board of Godrej and Boyce Manufacturing Company Limited. He wears many hats. He is the president of Worldwide Fund for Nature in India. He is the chairperson of the board of directors of Shakti Sustainable Energy Foundation, India Resources Trust, and Council on Energy, Environment and Water. I'll stop there because it's a long list. So with these words, let me get into the session, the operative part of the session. We will have a 45-minute conversation with our panelists, in which we will ask first the panelists to make their opening comments. And once they make the opening comments of about 4 to 5 minutes, we will get into a Q&A with them. I can see that, we already have quite a few participants have already joined and on this webinar, and my request to them is that we should not wait for the 45-minute session on Q&A to be over before sending their questions or observations or comments. As and when they feel they are up to it, they should send us their questions, observations, so that as soon as they finish with our Q&A session, we can take those up to elicit more information, more comments from our panelists. With these words, I will now ask Dr. DUBASH to give his opening comments. And as I said, that it would be nice to restrict your preliminary observations to 4 to 5 minutes. Dr. DUBASH. You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Bhattacharya. Thank you to Ananta Aspen Center for organizing this event and inviting me along. I don't think we'll have too much trouble eliciting questions. I see there are a couple already on the chat before we've even started, so that's a good sign. And I look forward to a great conversation. I'd like to just start in less than 4 minutes with a couple of larger overarching comments. I think the question of how can a stimulus be green is a really interesting one. I think we've all agreed that at this moment, the COVID situation, both the health as well as the lives and the livelihoods issues have to be dominant. We have to get India back on track. We have to get the vulnerable back to work. This is a paramount importance for all of us, including those of us who work full-time on environmental issues. The question is, can we do it in a way, is there only one path to doing that? And I think the answer is no. And that's where the green stimulus question comes in. There are probably multiple pathways to getting people back to work and making sure. And we have to then do that assessment of which pathways are more likely to move us in an environmentally sustainable path in the future and which pathways are not. And I guess one broad issue I have with our stimulus package is actually a recovery package, is that I'm not sure we've had that thought process. We haven't asked other options here. And is building towards a cleaner future part of the consideration? So let me just take maybe a couple of examples off the top. One of the signals that the government has sent, quite correctly, is that job creation is going to be very important, right? But it is not so clear to me that some of the measures that are taken actually will lead to job creation. Some of the things that are happening on the sidelines of the stimulus, such as the environmental impact assessment notification and weakening of that, it is not really clear to me that the environmental impact procedures are what are the hold-up right now to job creation. There are many more structural factors. And we might be actually pushing the Indian economy in a direction that will be more costly in the future. Let me take another example. We are stimulating the energy sector in quite a big way, in two different ways. One, there are incentives for private investment in coal, opening up the coal sector, making it easier for investment in coal. At the same time, we are championing the renewable energy sector, solar and batteries, and so on and so forth. Now, the question is, what do we see as the future of India's energy sector? Do we see coal playing a growing role? It is definitely going to play a big role. It is still a largest share of our electricity sector, for example. But do we anticipate that going to be growing over time? Or given that renewable energy is more cost competitive, in the last 5 years, 55% of capacity has been renewable energy and only 33% has been coal. Do we expect the renewable energy sector to become more and more important? If we look at those trends, shouldn't we be thinking strategically about which part of the energy sector we back? Why are we sending these mixed signals? In a sense, what we have is kind of an all of the above approach. We're going to push on all fronts simultaneously, and that is not strategic. So in those ways, I think our stimulus package could be a bit more strategic. It should be based on an analysis of which of the various pathways is more likely to lead us to a sustainable future. And why is a sustainable future important for India? At this time of COVID, I think one of the lessons to learn is that we are not a very resilient society. We are not resilient to the kinds of shocks that COVID has brought, and we are not very resilient to the kinds of shocks that, say, climate change will bring, to the health shocks that air pollution will bring. And so it is in our broader enlightened self-interest to move towards sustainability. Sustainability is not something that is independent from or divorced from economic choices. It is the underlying conditions from which we build our economy. So we shouldn't be cannibalizing our own resource base in pursuit of what seem to be some short-term economic gains, especially when those short-term economic gains may not even be realized, as is the case with the EIA notification. So just to end this, including this introductory piece, I think it is sensible to think about green in the context of stimulus. We're not looking at a situation like the West, where they have the fiscal space to throw a lot of money at the problem. We don't. But we have to be much more careful about the signals we're sending about the structural changes in our economy and making sure that they are moving in the direction of a more rather than less sustainable economy in the future.
Thank you, Dr. DUBASH. You sort of touched upon very key areas. You underlined the need for a strategic focus. If I understood you correctly, that strategic focus is right now missing. And you also raised a very important issue, which I felt was, the cannibalizing of resource base. Probably in the second round, I would like to come back to you and understand from you on both these issues of how it can be more strategic, the focus can be more strategic, and as well as how not to cannibalize the resource base. So these are two very important issues that you have raised, and I think we'll come back to it. Let me now go to Ms. Arora, and may I request you, Ms. Madam Arora, to give her preliminary observations on how she perceives the green stimulus and the economic relief package that has been announced so far, and how she sees it will pan out.
Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya, and I want to also thank Ananta Center for this opportunity, and also I think compliment the center for thinking about doing a conversation on this subject. As you rightly mentioned, we need to
have more conversations on whether the, the package, the stimulus that has been announced is actually green and can result in green growth. Let me just, my opening part, just mention about the fact that in CII, we have done a bit of an analysis from the green lens, just for our own understanding to see how, we could use the announcements that have been made by the government to maybe integrate, maybe push towards a green and more inclusive, development. Just to give a few examples, I mean, of course, as NAVROZ said, it lacks the strategic intent maybe, but if we really look at some of these announcements, like what has been announced for the MSME sector, the 100% credit guarantee cover to banks and NBFCs, and there's a huge tranche of money given there. Of course, it is first primarily for, lives and livelihood coming back, but we believe that if there was, further advocacy to see how these, credit linkages that are now being provided can also be linked to certain kind of green criteria. So some way of saying that, okay, as we know, MSMEs on their own probably will not be able to invest in, technologies which move them onto a low carbon pathway. But while we are giving them this, credit guarantee and these, loans which are collateral free, there is a possibility and an opportunity to develop, some kind of strategic, options for the MSMEs linked to their, taking up these loans, where we push them into the direction of becoming more energy efficient, invest in lower, carbon pathways. So dispersal of loans could actually be linked to that. Maybe it's not that they have to prove that they are on that path in the immediate future, because that might be difficult, but it could be from a long-term lens, the next two or 3 years, they have to move in that direction. So there is a, a possibility and an opportunity there. Second example, maybe I would like to take is, there's also a, in the economic stimulus package, there is, of course, a very rightly so, a huge focus on the agriculture sector, right? There are concessional credits to crores of farmers, 200,000 crores of, money there. We believe that, this again can be used to drive resilient agriculture practices. So against these credit, if we could, look at, pushing for, more sustainable agriculture practices, sustainable use of land, which can drive even carbon sequestration, can also bring better quality of food produce. So there again is an opportunity that we can do, try and leverage. The third example that I would like to take is in the package, there is, this credit linked subsidy scheme for middle income families, for investment in housing. And this is to bring back, the real estate sector. Now, if customers who are going to be availing this loan should be encouraged to invest only in homes which follow green building norms. So this could be added on to the criteria that when they are actually going for this credit link subsidy, how do they, make sure that, again, you don't lock this into a high carbon pathway, but a low carbon pathway. And finally, I think, again, adding on to what I mentioned about the agriculture sector, there's also this, investment available in terms of the announcement of 1 lakh crores fund for strengthening farm gate infrastructure, like cold chain, post-harvest storage infrastructures, etc. Here again, it should be ensured that this, fund is only for, those kind of infrastructure which follows the National Action Plan on Cooling, which makes sure that, we are making sure that all of these issues of green and environment and, the commitments that the government has made both at Paris and Kigali are kept in mind. So I believe that there is opportunity to further leverage the existing package by doing better, in terms of advocating for how some of these examples that I gave can help in making sure that whatever we are actually putting back into the economy is in some ways looking at making the green lens also is also put through that. And of course, there's much more to do, like you mentioned, Mr. Bhattacharya, but I will stop here. And when you come back to the next segment, I would like to comment on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Arora. I think you made, you have helped me in sort of focusing the discussion to some of the areas that probably we need to direct our attention to, in the sense that you talked about the MSME sector, you talked about the credit linkages, you talked about agriculture, and also you talked about the huge opportunities that still exist in using the green lens to ensure that the economic relief package can become more effective. So we will certainly come back and quiz you more on all these issues. Now it's my turn to go to Mr. Godrej and seek his pretty opening comments on how he sees the green stimulus and the economic relief packages, to what extent they have intermeshed with each other, and what more can be done. Mr. Godrej.
Thank you, AKB. And, I want to first greet everyone on the call today, since it is the International Day of the Tiger. And it's very appropriate that we are talking about green growth on the International Day of the Tiger. And it is an iconic animal, and I think everyone in India looks forward to conservation of the tiger. And, I want to focus initially on just one thing, which is that, this pandemic has clearly shown us that our pattern of urbanization and housing has failed. The sense is that, if you do not create sustainable urbanization and housing, which essentially, allows people to live a little more separate than they are and not crammed 15 people in a room. If you have transport systems that don't require people to move for 2 hours every day in the morning and 2 hours in the evening for their jobs, and if you create open spaces, not just for exercise, but also for the lungs of the city to breathe, I think you will find that this pandemic and other pandemics, which according to experts, we should expect more such things happening in the future, we are going to have more difficulties. And so I want to just focus a little bit on what is being known in these urbanization development circles as the 15-minute city. So the 15-minute city, 15 minutes, means that no matter what you want to do, where you want to go, what job you want, everything is within 15 minutes. Now, 15 minutes ideally should be walking or cycling, but that's not very practical always to do. But say within 15 minutes by car, which would be about 5, that you should be able to, within 5 kilometers, you should be able to more or less have everything that you need. And that, I think, concept is a very strong concept. And the green stimulus should really be looking at what we can do today, which will benefit us for the future. I know there is a here and now problem of income. There is a here and now problem of jobs. There is, there are all these big issues that have been thrown up by the pandemic. But I think that the stimulus should really focus on that. And, there's a big connection, of course, with stranded assets. There's a connection with the banking system. There's a connection with all types of investment that are required for the future. And if we just concentrate on what is it that will lead to economic growth for the future, what do we need to do now, in a sustained manner, not just, for a few months, but in a sustained way, which will really lead to that difference, so that in future, when we do have these types of pandemics, we will be much more resilient. So I think it's important to build infrastructure. It's important to build future sort of cities that reduce our tendency to be, hit by such pandemics. And I think this, the world has shown, that urbanization is not something that you can stop, but to do it in the right way, which leads to good health and good economic growth, good jobs, all of that is really crucial. Let me just mention this to begin with, and we'll come back to other things later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Godrej. I think you touched upon the real key areas. You talked about, thinking long in the sense that, focus on infrastructure, focus on the banking sector, focus on the coal. So I think you have given us enough food for thought to sustain this conversation and take to the next stage. I'm a little curious to know a little more from Dr. DUBASH on what if he's the Environment Minister of India today, what would he like to do in terms of giving the kind of strategic focus that he talked about, and particularly in the areas of agriculture and the power sector? These are the two critical areas which Ms. Arora was talked about, Mr. Godrej was talked about. So if you wear the hat of the Environment Minister in this country, and there is a pandemic there, and then there is a Finance Minister who is saying, I want growth, I want economic activity to come back, couldn't care less about whether it is green or not. So what would be the the strategic focus of a policy apparatus to address the twin challenges of ensuring growth, making it sustainable as well? So please take your time, Dr. DUBASH, but give us your wisdom on what should be the policy focus and the strategic focus in this area. Dr. DUBASH. You have not unmuted yourself. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I don't know about wisdom, but I can share some initial thoughts. Sure. And thank you, first of all, for the promotion to Environment Minister. But the problem is that the promotion is not enough. Okay. And I think this is it's a very good entry point to this conversation. It is not enough for the Environment Minister alone to be thinking about the environment. And sometimes I have to say, I wonder whether our Environment Minister even thinks enough about the environment, or not just this minister, but a series of ministers. They, as you say, they are hemmed in by pressures by, frankly, more powerful ministries. So before I get to what we could do, I think we have to focus a little bit on how we think about it. And I talked earlier, Mr. Godrej talked about it, I think SEEMA talked about it too. We don't have a strategic vision for this country that looks at what sort of development we want, what kind of urbanization we want. And unfortunately, it cannot be the purview of a single ministry. If you're looking at urbanization, for example, of course, it's for one thing, it's across different levels of the government. It's also urban local bodies, state government, central government, and so on. So there's sort of federalism issues. But what I want to get at is, let's take the energy sector. Energy sector is tied to mining. It's tied to water. It's often tied to certainly to questions of where the money is going to come from. It's tied to questions of science and technology and how we develop new technologies and create jobs with it. So my point is that we have no place in the government of India where these things are looked at systematically. We earlier had the Planning Commission, which had done a series of studies through committees, but wasn't always listened to. Niti Aayog, if anything, has less capacity than the old Planning Commission does. And so a lot of concerns about long-term direction are kicked to the PMO. So for example, climate decisions end up being taken more and more just through the PMO, what we say in international negotiations, what our messaging should be, with the Ministry of Environment acting more in a sort of secretariat role, pulling people together. We have nothing analogous to, say, a National Security Advisory Board, that looks at security from a broad point of view and sets and charts a direction, or a national security advisor. We need that level of strategic thinking, including voices from the outside, including academics, civil society, labor groups, and so on, so we can deliberate on what the best course forward is. Now, you can't do that in a crisis. You have to have been doing your homework all the way through. So when you come to a crisis, you're ready with your directions. So I think the only long-term solution to this is really actually building up those structures of those institutions for those conversations. Let's just take the climate issue, right? So somebody sent me a very curious little graphic where they showed this kind of COVID wave, and behind that was an even bigger recession wave, and behind that was an even bigger climate change wave, you know, all about to swamp us. And the fact is that COVID has had massive impacts. The future impacts on climate change for India could be even bigger. And the Indian Institute of Tropical Meteorology has just come out with a very exhaustive document documenting all those challenges. How do we anticipate what is going to happen in the future with regard to energy, urbanization, and so on and so forth in a climate constrained world? We don't have those processes in place at the moment. Every 5 years, the Paris Agreement requires us to put on the table what India will do. We don't have a systematic process for coming up with those things. Episodically, just before we try and quickly pull machinery together in the government to make this happen. So I'm sorry to dwell on this point, but we have to do better in how we make these decisions, and not just do it, expect that an environment minister can very quickly on the fly come up with these big strategic things. It is not his or her fault if they can't pull this off. There needs to be adequate backup. So now given this fact, let me give a couple of examples though, of the kinds of things we could do. But I don't want to lose sight of that how question, please. So let's take the power sector. Now, the power sector, for the longest time, the core issue in the power sector has been that we have, for much of India, for the poorest of Indians, we have low quality power, and they are reluctant to pay. So the bargain that has been struck is, okay, we'll give you cheap power, but it'll be very low quality. It'll be intermittent, your transformers will burn out, etc., etc. And at times of elections, we'll throw you a bone and give you free or subsidized power. Now, what happens on the back of that is that people invariably hook the lines, they thieve, they bypass the system, line meters collude, the meter people collude, you have theft and so on and so forth, and the discoms end up in the red, right? This is a 20-year problem. How have we approached it? Every few years, we give the discoms a bailout package, and we kick the can down the road. We say, you must reform or else. But there is no or else, because you can't turn off the lights. Because if you turn off the lights, the government will be voted out of power. We have not had a systematic response to this. Now, what if we rethought the power sector and we said, instead of thinking about this low cost power, bad quality power for cheap price or no price, what if we focused on making sure that rural populations could increase their productivity from power? If they increase their productivity, instead of subsidizing the cost of power, we subsidize capital expenditure that allows them to use electricity more productively. Some of the things that SEEMA talked about in agriculture, for example, cold chains and so on and so forth. That then raises the paying capacity and the willingness to pay of rural populations. So you make a structural change. The power sector has to be about actually serving as an engine of development and thinking about how rural areas in particular gain more productivity from power, not just the one light, one fan kind of syndrome that we have. That also feeds into a COVID story. If you have a well set up rural system with employment and productivity, you do not have this economy that is as dependent on migrant labor sloshing around in a very vulnerable way, sometimes seasonal migration, sometimes annual migration, and so on. Now, there's a bigger debate. I think there's a real question as to whether or not you can stop rural to urban migration, or whether you should even want to. Historically, that is always what's happened. But I don't think the two are necessarily exclusive. One can think about how you power the rural areas in ways that systematically improve productivity, not through consumption subsidies, but through capital subsidies. finding strategically the best bets for improving productivity and employment prospects in rural areas. So your power sector problem has to become part of your employment and jobs problem, which is why it cannot sit in just the power ministry or just the environment ministry. So that's maybe one example, and I'll pause there. Sorry, if I might just before I add, a small advertisement that we've done a sort of a brief on this point, and we have a webinar at CPR this evening at 5:30 where we're discussing this and related issues, including with Arvind Subramaniam. So anybody interested, please feel free to sign up to that Center for Policy Research webinar. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Dubash. Just one supplementary to what you said. You talked about instead of, subsidize the capital expenditure of power, rethinking the power sector. Now, will that address the larger issue about cross-subsidization in tariffs?
So the idea is that the reason we have cross-subsidization right now, so we have this, just to explain to the audience something that may already be familiar to most people, is that because you have more and more loss-making segments of your consumer base, households, rural users are all agriculture is all loss-making. Therefore, the amount that commercial and industrial users have to pay is growing and is actually well above the average. And we're one of the few countries where that is the case. In most countries, commercial and industrial users pay less because they are job-creating sectors. And so commercial and industrial cross-subsidizes households and agriculture. So yes, the idea is very much that if you increase the productivity, use the productivity potential of electricity, maybe you don't have to subsidize that much, right? Because people are in a position to pay and they see the benefits of paying from high capacity power. So what we have done is the other way around. We have said to rural consumers, you please pay more, you please pay a cost recovery tariff, and then we will make sure that you get what you pay for. And the rural consumer says, that's a very poor bargain. I don't believe you, because for all these years, it's never happened. Why don't you give me better quality power first? And then once I see that, I'll pay for it. So we are in this catch-22 situation. And I think the only way out is to, in fact, credibly provide a down payment on better quality power and on deliberate efforts to invest in productivity enhancements, because then that generates the income through which you can actually pay cost recovery tariffs.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Dubash. Let me now go to Ms. ARORA and try to understand from the way this discussion is moving is it seems to it's suggesting that we need basic structural changes, in a sense that if you don't facilitate a kind of integrated thinking on how to make stimuli work from a green perspective, we will probably lose our primary goals. Now, from your vantage point in CII, how would you see such an organizational revamp, something like a national, integrated environment policy framework wherein different ministries are involved? How do you see this? Is that a way forward, and is that a feasible thing? That's question number one. And question number two is you have focused a lot on agriculture, and you also spoke about agriculture in your preliminary comments. And the question that arises is that just like in power, agricultural policies also have many basic flaws that encourage the kind of agriculture which are not green, in a sense that the agricultural pricing of crop or procurement prices are such that it encourages the kind of crops that are grown in larger numbers which use more water, for example, even though we may not need them. So is there a policy approach change needed also in agriculture, just as Dr. Dubash talked about the need for a change in policy approach in the power sector? So if you could address these two issues, It will be wonderful.
Thank you, Mr. Bhattacharya, and I couldn't agree more with NAVROZ that the whole issue is that we look at, and not just environment, any issue in a very silo-based approach. Even this pandemic, as we can see, it started as a health crisis, and we did not look at what the impact on the humanitarian side or the economic side could be. We just focused, and that's not just India, world over. So I think the problem really, or the core issue, is that as institutions, as as businesses, as all stakeholders in a society, we are not looking at the interconnectedness of issues. And that is my main point. Unless we start to look at the interconnectedness of these issues and develop any kind of policies, any kind of institutional mechanisms, any kind of, I would say, action that we want, from a lens of looking at how these are interconnected, and also looking at it from a systems approach. What's very important is also that we need to look at these from a systems approach. Let me just, again give one example. I think that, to NAVROZ's point, I mean, there is, it's impossible for just one ministry or one government, one department of a ministry, or to really look at this whole issue of, sustainable development, as we call, right? It's really, we are talking of that in the next 20 years, how do we become a sustainable economy? So I think that the mandate has to lie with each and every department. Each and every ministry has to use the sustainability lens, has to use the sustainable development lens, but not like a checklist approach, which normally happens. Even in businesses, it happens, unfortunately, that if we are saying that we are looking at how do we become sustainable in the next 10 years, what we do is we create some parameters and we say, okay, we're already doing this. Maybe we just tweak this and we become more sustainable. That's not the approach we need to take. We fundamentally need to make structural changes. I want to take an example of something that in CII we have been trying to, really propagate, and that's called, and NAVROZ had mentioned that, that's really looking at circular practices, or how do we build a circular economy? NAVROZ talked about the cannibalization of resources. Really, we need to look at how do we build, have circular practices built and implemented into policies with respect to almost every sector, whether it's agriculture, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's service sector, right? So every ministry, every department, every business has to look at it. Basically, it would make sure that you prevent the environment from being used as a dump that we nowadays use it as. It will also make business more resilient and competitive, because when you're doing circular practices, you're actually becoming more competitive. And it will conserve resources for those who have the poorest sections of the society, which are the most vulnerable and do not get access to these resources. So this is the kind of approach we need to take. With one example, if we were to say that we want to transition to a circular economy model, that's how you need to look at it. But that should not lie with the environment ministry alone, because environment ministry cannot come up with a circular economy model for the country. It needs to be a collective effort. The second point example I want to give to just illustrate the point that NAVROZ was making and what you asked me, we need to take a One Health approach that needs to be adopted. Health is not just for the human beings, it's also for the ecosystem. It's also for the biodiversity. So where is our approach of One Health? So while we are trying to now, make sure that, and it's important that human health is saved, what we are noticing or what we are, witnessing is because we have not looked at how we make sure that the ecosystem and the biodiversity associated with it's healthy. So we need to definitely look at all these interconnections and make sure that we are looking at a systems approach. And that's where, again, as NAVROZ said, it's not done in the time of crisis, but crisis is an opportunity, right? So if this is an opportunity for us to reflect and to say that, okay, so that we become more resilient, so that we are better prepared, what do we do? This is the time to have those conversations, do those deep dives and say, this is how we need to be prepared as a country, as an economy, as different stakeholders. So this would be my, a point for your first, question that you had posed for me. Going into the second question of agriculture, frankly, I'm not an agriculture expert, so I would not claim to be one. I would just like to, again, and I like to share examples because that's from where we learn. So, and I would just like to share, what we have learned about agriculture in India through some work that we have been doing in CII and also with the CII Foundation. Essentially, we are most of us on the on this platform would be aware of the practice that farmers use to burn their crops when they're doing, from rice harvesting to wheat harvesting. And we know more of this practice in Northwest India because it contributes to also air pollution, and we all get, suffocated in Delhi. So we worry about it. But of course, it's a practice that goes around many parts of the country and also internationally, by the way, in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, etc. It happens. So it's not just here. Now we tried to understand that what could be the solution. We of course started from the air pollution lens because being an environmentalist, that is what we knew best. Very soon we realized if we look at it from an environment lens, we'll never solve it. We look at it from a pollution lens, we'll never solve it. We actually started to then understand from the farmer and use the farmer lens to see how we can solve this problem, right? And we understood, and actually this is a very unsustainable agriculture practice to your question, because when they burn, essentially the farmers burn because one, they believe that the cost of burning is much lesser. They do not have, frankly speaking, they do not have access to a cost-effective alternative methods, which now are getting, I would say, are finding penetration into the, into the villages, etc., because the government announced a subsidy on some of the equipment that is necessary. So what we basically did as CII, and that's where we actually understood also, we tried to create a shared model of having, providing access to the farmer of the equipment that the farmers need. But coupled with that was the very important thing of training the farmer. So if you want the farmer to change practice, if you want the farmer, and if you want sustainable agriculture practices to be driven on the ground, right? Policy is one part of it and would be required. And I mentioned that if you're giving them credit, link it to, some of these practices. But it won't happen just automatically, as we know. We actually need to handhold the farmer. My favorite example is that, we have in the auto industry transition from Euro BS4 to BS6. And the industry has trained their workers, has trained their supply chains. How should they change? How should they, change their manufacturing setup? We ask the farmer to change from burning his crop to non-burning of crop without giving any training, without handholding. It's never going to happen. Similarly, to actually make this happen, to really have this transformation at the ground level, we need to work. We need to actually make the ecosystem, that is the ecosystem of the agriculture sector, whether it's the KVKs, whether it's the universities, whether it is the block development officer, all of these have to really work to help the farmer make the change. Farmer is more than happy to make this change. Believe me, what we learned was, farmers told us, the only way we will change behavior is if you stop giving subsidy on the electricity. If you make the subsidy on the seeds conditional, nobody will burn. We of course said, okay, let us look at how we can provide you that equipment, how we can share the cost, the capital cost, how we can reduce the operational cost through an Uber model, and how can we help you understand the better sustainable farmer practices, by which now the farmer, over the 2 years that we've worked with them in 152 villages in Punjab and Haryana, is saving nearly 30% of water, 30% of the weedicides that they have to actually, put in. And now the farmer is coming to us and saying, can you please help us do that? The larger question that you asked, crop diversification, very, very important. I think that is the root cause. What I mentioned is just to give an example of how you can, in the existing framework, make the changes. That certainly is the, the most important thing. And I think during this pandemic, one thing that, not good, but one positive shoot that we saw was the farmers actually came and said, because we don't have labor, what should we do? Because planting rice is very labor intensive. So we have started to work with the government and say, what are the alternative crops that they can come in with? So I think there are some things that we can, use there as well. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Arora, for enlightening us on this. I was trying to actually come there only. Just one supplementary, Dr. DUBASH is an academic, but you are actually in the field, dealing with the government on a day-to-day basis. So the suggestion that there should be a kind of a integrated, centralized, structural change, a structural body to deal with issues that relate to green issues in a manner that is right now is not possible in the current structure. My question to you is that do you see there are fears of over-centralization in such a structure? Because in many governance structures, I'm not talking about India here, what happens is that when you have a central body, either it is a central trade negotiator or whether it is a security advisor, there is a tendency towards over-centralization where one person or a few people have a greater say in the policy-making apparatus. Now, are the dangers in the environment side as real there, or you think that a more participative kind of structure is more advisable?
So I don't know if I heard NAVROZ say that a centralized structure was required. I don't think that is what I heard say, but anyway, yes, what you pointed out in terms of dangers of a centralized structure, I think about 10 years ago, if I remember correctly, or maybe less than 10 years ago, there was a proposal to have a National Environment Protection Agency, NEPA it was called. A proposal was mooted by the government itself. And we were a part of that in terms of the stakeholder consultation. It was to say, and I think what NAVROZ and I were mentioning was actually not just environment, but actually embedding environment and making environment a part of everybody's job actually. That's what, but even if we were to just look at the Environment Ministry and say have a more centralized, more coherent structure, there was a proposal called the NEPA. There was a huge pushback, like you rightly said, especially by the states, because the states definitely want to have, at the moment there's a structure of the state pollution control boards. They have, the right to implement and enforce. And as you know, it's not, nobody wants to give up that power that they have, right? So that was really the pushback we had. But if we were to design a more integrated approach, it need not necessarily mean a more centralized approach. Planning, yes. Yes, planning with all those integrated approaches, yes. But need not mean execution and power to one central authority. At least that's the way I look at it. And I think there'll be more appetite.
I may have misunderstood Dr. DUBASH on this. I stand corrected. Am I right?
Yeah. If I could come in for just a second, no, certainly not the idea. I don't think it's feasible to have a body, in a sense, sitting on top. It's not even consistent with our political economy. These ministries are not going to give up power and coal and agriculture, not going to give up their power so easily. I think it's better to maybe turn the question around and say, what are the kinds of functions that are not being served at the moment, right? So there's no analysis function being served. We don't have a way of saying, what are the bets we should place on RE versus coal? We don't have that. We don't have a bet that says, what are the alternative crop choice patterns in Haryana and Punjab, given the water situation, given the migrant situation? We don't have that analysis. We don't have a deliberative structure. We don't know how to take a different set of views into account in a way that's sensible. We already see sort of all kinds of issues around the comment process for the environmental impact notification and so on and so forth. That we don't have, so for example, a white paper format where we put out a white paper for broad discussion. We don't have coordination across ministries, except in the form of people basically going by rank order, implicit rank order, which secretary will hold open the door for which secretary and so on. Everybody knows their pecking order, but there's no real coordination structure that happens. So these are the kinds of functions that need to be served. And then we have to design an institution that meets those functions, given the real constraints and the fact that we're not a society that will have some top-down construct. So that is what I meant.
I understand that. I'm glad I raised the issue, even though I misunderstood it, but I think it's given us a lot of clarity on what kind of structure change that you want. I think that will be a very important input. Let me turn to Mr. Godrej. You talked about the issues about how we should move towards a kind of sustainable urbanization planning. And I think this idea of a 15-minute city is something that is probably a key to this sustained urbanization model that you talked about. Linked to that, I think it will be good if you can speak a little more about this sustainable urbanization planning model, in what way it can actually contribute to a kind of a green stimulus. The government has taken a lot of the smart city projects. Are these green enough in your view? Can they be tweaked? And that is one issue that is coming up in my mind. The second one is about a sector that we haven't talked about as much as we should have, which is about the coal sector. We have a huge problem about the coal capacity, which is right now probably getting outcompeted because of the renewable power. Now, what do you do with the stranded coal capacity? What is the best way forward, keeping in mind the ecological concerns? So if you could touch upon these two issues, one, sustainable urbanization, and second, how do you tackle the coal issue in view of the rise of the renewable power?
Yeah. Thank you. I think, first of all, we all accept that urbanization is a trend that is global. Second is that when we talk of urbanization, we can't be talking about only the negative aspects of urbanization. I think urbanization has many good benefits that the country and city can benefit from. But we have not, again on urbanization, we have not looked at it holistically. You see, it's not only about transport and housing. It's also about sustainable finance. For a large city like Mumbai or Delhi or any other global city, there has to be a close integration in the financial viability of a city. Whether it's to do with taxes, it's to do with how you finance infrastructure, whether you have bonds and things like that. So I think, this whole idea of a city and making it sustainable has to be in every area. I think we tend to focus on the housing and the transport, but there are so many other parts of a city, that which is to do with, how are we going to provide the healthcare? Okay, the healthcare has been, this COVID pandemic has more or less told us that we have something that we knew all along, that we have underinvested in our health systems. But it's not just a question of underinvested. You need to provide appropriate healthcare for every sector of our population. If you have only super specialty hospitals, that's not going to solve the problem. You've got to start with neighborhood clinics and move on, from there onwards to super specialty. Also, then how do you make it affordable? What is the role of finance and insurance in this? So there are so many interconnected issues to do with, having a good urban policy that, if we do have a good urban policy, I think you would address a very large part of the sector in India, which creates jobs and creates growth. I want to only talk about a little bit on the transport side. We are, of course, investing public money and borrowing large sums of money for public transport. Of course, it's a little too late and not enough. But at the same time, I think there is a realization that private transport is not going to solve our problem. And even if it has to be private transport, what is the type of transport that you need? So I think, the stimulus, that we are talking about green stimulus here, the stimulus that you can get by good practices for urbanization, will last us for decades together if we do it right. So I think that's really crucial to get it right. I think the lens that we have to follow, for all this type of infrastructure is the green lens. That is it enhancing our green infrastructure and the green and the resilience, or is it not? Very often we see the debate in cities like Mumbai, for instance, there's a huge debate about whether trees should be cut to provide some infrastructure for metro or something like that, So it's not, and people do get activated by such things because, greenery is an important aspect of people's lives and that well-being necessity. So I think the debate has to be much larger on green. It cannot only be about trees, and this is really crucial. So I would hope that a good urban policy, a good sustainable urban policy, can be a huge driver of jobs and growth, and it would lead to our cities being much more livable. We know, in many parts of the world, this concept of a livable city, is really been promoted to a very large extent because of the public voices of the peoples who live in these cities, have been talking about it. And I think we need to be able to hear the voices of the people who live and work in the city in this respect. And I think you will find that for them also, having to sit in a train and be transported 2 hours each direction is just not something that they would want to have for the rest of their lives. And so we've got to understand, what makes, a city really vibrant. Secondly, I think you mentioned coal. It's quite interesting. There have been a number of articles recently which have been talking about the fact that asset managers have now become eco-warriors. And I think there's a realization that, we have to be able to have that sustainable finance for various things. One of them, of course, is the power sector. And you asked me specifically about coal and the fact that renewables today, along with storage, you can build a new power plant today based on renewables and storage, which would be less expensive, economically less expensive, not just in terms of how much you invest in it, but also all the side effects that you would have, which is health, especially health, working conditions, and all the related issues around that. The cost of those can be much, much lower. So the interesting thing is that, many people have talked about what are the types of investments one should do, which are good for the future. And here, this is exactly the point on coal has been a mainstay of electricity generation in India. I think it was absolutely essential at a time when, you didn't have alternatives. We have not invested, say, in nuclear energy, like, say, France had, where 75% of their energy did come from nuclear. But now that we have a situation, where renewables with storage are very, very competitive, we should seriously think about how to retire old power plants, say everything over 20 years, 25 years. It's not just on cost, but look at the social benefit that you would get. Less pollution, less toxic pollution. For instance, power plants were supposed to have installed large amounts of pollution control equipment, which they have deferred because of the cost involved. So, I think we should say, okay, what's the best thing to do? Better to retire these plants, and replace them with renewables and storage. And this is something, this can lead to huge amounts of investment. The banks will be benefited. The banks today have got stuck, because of all these non-performing assets and stranded assets in the coal sector. It will be a huge boost, for everybody, for the economy, for the banks, for individuals to have cleaner air. I think one of the interesting things that came out of this pandemic was that the cities started realizing that they were breathing again. The pollution levels in cities like Bombay and Pune and Delhi, etc., became so clean. It's just amazing how clean they have become as a result of reduced economic activity. And so it clearly shows you the one-to-one connection. Same way with water. We've had a program, to clean the Ganga River, for the last, as long as I can remember, But amazingly, because of all the industries along the river having closed down, the water cleaned up on its own. So it shows that, when you have the right sort of policy, which means that you don't put pollution in the air, you don't put pollution in the water, it will transform. And I think that we need to, keep on thinking about how we can achieve that, as part of the green stimulus. I think green stimulus is something where you want to put money, into something that will result in a good economic development and have lots of co-benefits like environment.
Thank you, Mr. Godrej. Thank you for this extensive sort of elaboration on the issues that were raised. Just one, we have begun receiving comments. So one comment has come. I thought I will ask you this. There's a comment from Navita Mahajan, who is saying that Chandigarh is a model of a 15-minute city. And she's saying that actually 7-minute city. And so is that what you actually were hinting at? Chandigarh kind of a city where it is a 7-minute city apparently.
Yes, I think that this is the idea. The 15-minute city idea really is that within 15 minutes, you're living there, you're working there, you're providing all the amenities that you need. I think Chandigarh, because it was a planned city right from the beginning, allowed for open spaces, etc. Of course, that is it. But I think, if you see a city like Mumbai or Delhi, we know that no matter where you want to go, it's going to take you a lot longer than 7 minutes or 15 minutes. But it's not just that. Just think of the negative aspect of that. How much air pollution is affected by having long commutes and things like that, you see. And so hopefully, we will have more cities which are thought of in that way, that, and Chandigarh is a good example of that.
That's right. Thank you. Let me take a couple of more questions. Let me turn to Dr. DUBASH. There's a question from Vincent Pala, which says that, do you think that open auction of captive coal mines into free selling in the market is not sustainable in the future? Or do you think this is a good idea as per the ease of doing business? So I think, either or situation. So how would you respond to that question?
Well, I think what I'm hearing from people who study the coal sector more carefully than I do is that the key issue in coal is not ease of doing business. The key issue in coal is the fact that it is being outcompeted by renewable energy. Already, as Mr. Godrej was saying, the cost of renewable energy plus storage is already coming into line with coal. And for an investor, they're not just looking at whether you make money today. You're looking at whether you make money for the next at least 15 to 20 years when you're looking at a coal-fired power plant. If the trend line is very clearly in the direction of coal, even without the cost of fully internalizing the cost of pollution, you're not internalizing the cost of pollution. Even without that, coal is being outcompeted. A sensible society would internalize the cost of pollution, as Mr. Godrej said. We would be putting in those FGD and other pollution control equipment and not pushing the can down the road. So what I'm hearing, the smart people who track this are saying, we don't think that this is going to actually lead to a flood of investment in the coal sector. We don't think that overseas investors and miners and power plant operators are going to be willing to brave what they see as a very complex market that is dominated by an incumbent like Coal India Limited. We are not sure whether some of the big domestic players would go down this road, because they already have a road for private participation in the form of the MDO route, which is the mine development route. So why would they take on the full risk of actually taking on a mine in total, as it were? So this comes back to the strategic question. What problem are we actually trying to solve? And it's not really clear that this is going to solve any problem. Now, I may be wrong. I'm not a coal expert, but the people I've talked to, this is their view. Yeah.
You know, AKB, I just want to highlight that the Reserve Bank governor, the Reserve Bank governor spoke to the CII National Council a couple of days ago. And the one thing that he put right on top of his discussion was renewables. He said, this is the time for renewables. Let's only talk about renewables, you know, when we talk of infrastructure to do with power. So I think the banks have recognized, you know, the problems they've had and the future that they see. And so I think it's a big indicator to us also.
So if I might just supplement that, I think there is an important coal question in India, but it is not the question of how do you actually get more money flowing into coal. I think the question is, how do you start thinking about what is going to be a decade-long transition out of coal? And how do we do that in a way that is not disruptive to the coal states and the very many millions of people whose lives and livelihoods are dependent on coal? We need to make sure that that transition happens smoothly. That should be the coal question we're asking.
That's right. We're running out of time, but I have to ask this question to Ms. Arora. This is a question that has come from Ramesh Vaswani. And he says that in the context of a structural change to address environmental issues and sustainable development, can we think of a GST council type of a structure? And also, can we look at models adopted successfully by some other countries to look at evolution of policies and action plans in a holistic manner? So I think, is the GST council, in your view, in a kind of a structure which I call a state participation? The center is there. Center doesn't have, strictly speaking, the veto power. The states are actually today larger than the center, even the budgets and all that. So a GST council probably is a way he's suggesting. So how would you, from your CII perspective also, how would you look at it?
I think it's a suggestion worth exploring. I mean, I don't have a yes or no answer for it. I do know that in some other countries, like was mentioned by him also, there are certain models. I particularly know that in Canada, there is a council of ministers from the state and the center, led by the prime minister of the country actually, which looks at this long-term planning, which looks at this, you know, I would say interconnectedness and says, and is much more scientific based as well. So I think it's a combination of things. It should not just be a political structure in my way. In my view, it should have a lot of other stakeholders also playing a part, especially the science-based organization. Because I think if we are thinking of the future, unless we are science-based, I don't think we'll make the right decisions.
Okay, good. I think we are coming to the end of this session, but I will not let my panelists go without their final, maybe a one-line or a two-line comment on their final words on this issue about green stimulus and what needs to be done for making the economic relief package more effective. Dr. DUBASH first.
Thank you, and it's a great conversation. Thank you for your able steering of it. I think the last point I would make is that we are not a country that has a lot of fiscal space, but we are a country that is changing very fast. So this phrase that has been thrown around by us all a lot, structural change, what are the patterns we are locking into? Because when you change fast, you have an opportunity through a small shift in direction to reach a very different endpoint. We have to seize that opportunity before we lock into unsustainable energy patterns, carbon patterns, air pollution patterns, water patterns. So that's what we have to think about. What are we locking ourselves into and what opportunities can we take advantage of now? Mr. Godrej made the point about buildings. That's another excellent example. That's what I would like to leave it with.
That's wonderful. Ms. Arora?
So I think this crisis, according to me, is a big opportunity to drive green and inclusive growth. And I think this would not only pave the pathway for the current generation, but also the future. And I think business, government, all stakeholders need to work in collaboration we must incorporate the principles of circularity. I think that would give us a lot of benefit. We must invest in innovations for low carbon. Let's see how we can do that. And also we must make agriculture resilient and drive a green movement through our MSMEs, because that's where I think the clear transformation is required. So I think as we come out of COVID, we should see that we plant this seed for green and inclusive growth. Your backdrop also has the seed there where people are watering it.
That's right.
I think and that it should take the shape of a sapling as we get out. And we would be not only economically more strong, but we will also be environmentally, and we'll give ourselves a better place to live in. Thank you.
Good. Mr. Godrej, you have the final word.
Yeah. You know, it reminds me that after the 2008 financial crisis in the USA, they had a very successful program called Cash for Clunkers. And the idea was that the government will pay money if you replace your old gas guzzling car with a modern, efficient car. It was so successful that they ran out of the money that they had allocated for that. And let me just mention 3 items which we could do something very similar in India. One, we have talked about renewables. So renewables, you could put a lot of money, and the banks, everyone would look at the future. You could put a lot of money into replacing polluting old and polluting coal-fired power plants with renewables and storage. Second, you could transform agriculture and water by actually giving away free, or even, for governments to give away solar pumps, and the paybacks could be 3-4 years, and that could be a similar thing where you allow government invests in solar pumps. And the third could be on the electrification of transport, which is, again, we know that electric cars and hybrid cars, etc., is really the future, So can there be a program where you basically tell consumers, we will give you a big subsidy per car that you buy if it is electric or hybrid? I mean, these are things which will transform, the economy, transform jobs, and create the green future we're looking for. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. When I began this session, I was not very clear that whether we'll be able to come out with some key points that we could probably talk about and leave our participants with. But I think thanks to this excellent panel experts here who talked about so eloquently, so clearly and candidly, and that we know that we need a strategic approach. We need some sort of organizational, approach change in the government. We need the right policy. And one final point is that the only lens to any economic relief package has to be the green lens. So I think that's a message that is coming through. I must extend my thanks to all my panelists and all the participants who stayed glued to this discussion. I can make out from this number, there has not been a decline in the number of participants who are there. So if Ananta Center wishes, and if we can have another session on this, second part of this session to continue this conversation. Thank you very much for those who joined us, and thank you, my dear panelists, Dr. DUBASH, Ms. ARORA, Mr. Godrej. Thank you. We close it here. I hand it over back to Pirina.